Hi, it's Alicia with Performentor, and we're doing another Heuristics podcast. Today, we're with Danvers Fleury. He's the founder of NextLX. This is a growth and discovery agency for positive impact organizations. He's also a serial entrepreneur and pretty much an all-around genius. He might not agree with me, but that's what I think. My podcast, I get to say that. Anything you'd like to add?
There's a couple things I'd like to subtract, but we'll go with that for now, Alicia. That's overly generous of you. Thank
you, Danvers. I'm so glad that we get a chance to talk. It's any opportunity is a good one. Well, anyway, the heuristic that we're going to talk about today, at least primarily to start with, is what we don't know is always greater than what we do know. Therefore, we should always be curious, not complacent. So curious, kind of what your initial reaction is to that.
My goodness. My initial reaction lands at a story which really defined my career early on. When I was a teenager, I was one of these bullheaded young CEOs during a time when you could get money. And then eventually the dot-com market crashed and I had to take a normal job. And so I took a digital marketing job at a company called Domania, which was sort of like Zillow before Zillow existed. It was a place where on the early web you could get information about what your home was worth. I was a very arrogant young man. I was very, very confident. And at one point I was given the opportunity to take over the website from a business perspective. And I had all these big ideas on how we could make more money. Now, I'd never spoke to one of our users. I was just looking at data, a lot of hubris here, but I knew that I was such a smart guy, I'd be able to figure this out. I made a list of about 10 improvements that we could make. And when we launched the first one, it had this like tiny little positive impact. And when we launched the second, it actually made things worse. And I was just going through all my best ideas of sort of what I knew was going to work. Mm-hmm. And at the end, I like number 7 on the list, I just had this idea of dropping a pop under that basically said, hey, you want to work with a realtor? And we doubled our revenue pretty much overnight. It was this runaway success. Uh-huh. And there were kind of 2 big things that hit me. Number 1, just this almost random testing ideas by the end was beating my best thinking. And number 2, I didn't understand why the winner won. Like that drove me crazy, more so than the fact that my supposed insights and intuition and all this other stuff were invalid. When we finally hit a winner, I couldn't even explain it. And I think that was the beginning for me from a career perspective of taking a more curious approach to any endeavor.
That's a great story.
It was very humbling, which was very needed. And yeah, it kind of began me on this journey of thinking about how do you discover the unknown? How do you even go about defining what you don't know and the importance of these gaps, right? I mean, when you have a success that you can't explain, how do you scale it? Generally, you can't unless you're very lucky.
Yeah. Well, do you think there's ways that you can be more lucky than other ways of going about things?
I think in general, we make our own luck, right? I mean, you've told me about that a couple of times, but when we go about defining what we don't know and interrogating that area to shed some light on it, or those areas to shed some light on it, or those nodes in the system, that's when things start to get really interesting. And I think the approaches or the algorithms we use to search are sort of secondary to defining the spaces that we search. So step number 1, silly as it sounds, is just getting honest with ourselves about what we don't know. And that, my friend, is a slippery slope, because oftentimes we don't even know what motivates us. They do these incredible studies where they put people in a room and they have the room start filling with smoke, and people generally only leave when other people start to leave. And if you asked them, why'd you leave the room? They'd say, oh, my life was at risk. When based on the numbers, when we sort of hit play through hundreds of study participants, people only get up when other people get up.
Yeah.
So many of our decisions are driven by stimuli that we don't even really fully comprehend.
Yeah.
And so I think the depths of what we don't know must run pretty deep when oftentimes we don't even know what motivates us or why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
And it takes a whole lot of confidence to then say, oh, I know why Alicia's doing what she's doing. If I'm being fully honest with myself, I don't even know what's motivating me half the time, right?
Yeah.
So it's a really fascinating thing to try to find ourselves these controlled experiments, to understand the why after being honest with ourselves about the what, what don't we know?
But don't we know? I know a lot of times we just start off with I know this, I know that, I know this, and we like when obviously you do now, but like, yeah, when do we ever say, here's what we don't know? Here's my listing.
Well, right. And you think about the cultural pressure to be an expert, right? I mean, how often do you get hired by saying, yeah, I've got no idea how to solve this problem? Here's all the things I don't know about this industry. It's really such a shame that sometimes humility and curiosity can be mistaken for foolishness when oftentimes it's a sign of wisdom.
I mean, that's really interesting because I often with the consultants I have on my team, it's and this came up in that book, The Trusted Advisor, that somebody pointed me towards, which is I'm like going, yes, all those things that I've learned the hard way. I would like my team to understand these things. Is that it's not so much, yes, you got to be at least enough of an expert to get your foot in the door. But once your foot's in the door, stop selling, just follow the process, work on developing that trust. And a lot of what we don't know, and this is a lot of how this comes up, at least in my business, a lot of what we don't know are all the contextual information that the client is experiencing, right, around the problem, that whatever it is we're there to solve. And sometimes they don't even know until you walk them through talking about it. And I know that's kind of how it comes up. But I mean, to your point, very often we're motivated to, well, I have to show that I'm an expert. I have to show that I'm knowledgeable. Like it would be the worst thing in the world if they thought I was stupid.
Well, and I was reading this chapter in your book, and I really liked how you were talking about this idea of the limit of our comprehension is sort of this window that we're looking through. It's sort of like I've got this, and I may have a huge window that I can see through or a tiny window. And I think our windows are very much defined by our experiences. And I know, at least with myself, I've had identity level I knows that were wrong. There was a period in my life at the beginning of COVID where I was just positive that I couldn't fix anything with my hands. Like that was just, I'd never fixed anything with my hands in my entire life, never done it. And then when you're working from home all the time, I'm wandering around and realizing, gosh, the treadmill's broken, the grill's broken, this door squeaks, deafeningly. And I had this gift of, YouTube. So, I'm just following recipes here, but I had this gift of getting some tools and following some videos and starting to fix things and challenging an identity level assumption I had on myself. And it was assumption, but it was really an I know. I had 40 years of evidence that really was just inaction. And so I think a really fascinating thing about this, knowing what you don't know or knowing what you can't do, when you test things, when you're allowed to reduce variables and just jump into the fray, you can learn that maybe black is white, maybe up is down. And I have all different critiques of moral relativism, and I don't want to get too crazy here, but just I think a lot of what we know is limited by our experiences. And when you have new experiences or you add people to your team that have very different experiences from you, sometimes things you thought weren't true, even about yourself. And I think if one accepts this, then I think it gives us permission to be very curious about almost anything that we think we're experts on, because chances are there's something that we don't know, and there's something that we know that's either wrong or has now changed, since we live in such a complex world where change is so consistent.
I remember watching a video because something you said reminded me of this, where there's like a neurophysiologist or something, and he said that you can't be curious and fearful at the same time. Think about that. I was just like, that blew me away. And I'd forgotten about that until you were just like, something about what you just said reminded me of that.
I mean, you talk about how you reframe things for the organizations you work with, but reframing curiosity as being a cousin of courage, or confidence, either one.
Gosh.
That's really kind of cool.
I think it's true. Like, it takes courage to be curious. Like, we have to let go of whatever fears or just, I don't know.
If you think about the most basic instance of curiosity, where you're in a classroom and you don't understand something and you raise your hand to ask the teacher in front of your peers. I mean, I can remember as a child, doing that and feeling nervous, right? I mean, it is interesting, though. I guess a counterpoint to what I said is the way I define courage for my sons is when you're taking action in the face of fear. And so that it requires no courage to be bold when you're not feeling fear. Yeah. So it is an interesting place to try to put curiosity in its relationship to courage.
Like you said cousin, so it's not the same thing.
Very much so. Yeah, no, cousin might work, right? There's certainly it's in the same family, it feels like. It
does, but maybe not directly. Yeah, related. It quiets it. At least, in the very least,
right? Or yeah. I mean, it's a part of the ride. Sometimes when I'm engaging in a discovery process, I am fretful because there's an important thing that I don't understand. Sometimes when I'm searching, I'm actually quite excited because it's almost like you're putting together a puzzle or you're solving a mystery as you get these different insights and these different results from experiments, and you're putting together a picture for maybe what an industry looks like, or how an audience is thinking within it, or the language they use, or the existential fears and desires that are driving, their core activities. It can be a whole emotional gamut, including none. It's just business. You're not thinking anything. You're just looking at the information. So but it's always, at the end of whatever the process is, when you go from knowing that you don't know something to at least having an informed hypothesis on it, that to me is when you have the confidence. We talked about courage versus confidence, and there's nothing worse to me than when people are launching a solution and they don't really know the problem, or they really don't know the people that they're solving it for. Yes. And that's usually, most of the worst projects where I've failed have been those, and certainly earlier in my career as well. So it's always wonderful to say that we know something is a big statement, but to say that we have a hypothesis on something that we previously were confident we knew nothing about, what a move towards a brighter future.
I think so. Yeah, I think that I lost. I was committed to listening to you, and I had an idea, and I let it go. Now I don't know what it was. But
thank you for being such a committed listener. I appreciate
that. but I think there's the being clearer with ourselves about what it is that we don't know. Often the assumptions that we're making, the implicit assumptions that we're making, and like I relate quite a bit to that journey of exploration when I'm getting to know, I'm getting to learn pest control business, auto repair business. I'm getting to learn the trailer sales, and it is so interesting. And it's just such a wonderful journey when I don't have to worry about showing up as somebody who knows everything about this industry, and just engage in, understanding and then seeing patterns. And then when I communicate something that feels like maybe I know it, saying it in a way that doesn't, like, it's not definitive. To me, it feels so much safer.
That resonates deeply. I think the worst work I've done is when I've come in and had overly much confidence in my understanding of the context and then skip the most important steps.
Asking questions.
Yes, ma'am.
And listening.
Right? Which you just did such a good job of, and you lost a good idea.
Well, I was reminded of one of my many heuristics, one of which is diagnose before you prescribe.
Nice.
we all get I've called this theory love sometimes, like or solution love. Like, I love my solution. It's I see it everywhere. It should be here. And I've actually run into trouble sometimes where somebody is asking for insight into kind of like, what is it that you guys do? And like, what are the models and the methods that you use? I'm trying to explain, we have principles, but we don't have a model. Our model is to be flexible and semi-customized to the conditions that confront us. But I know that that's hard to explain in a way that is understandable. But I know that I run into just such a big problem. Saying, loosey-goosey is what we do.
Yeah, once again, right? I mean, it could be misconstrued as a lack of intellectual rigor when in fact it's a commitment to a jazz process of sorts.
Jazz process, yes, and it is a commitment because I won't. We did do one kind of proposal with this organization, which would then potentially put us or other vendors in touch with the end client, and they're like throwing acronyms at me. I'm like, I don't even know what that acronym means. And I'll say that. Or I have a consultant who's just like, what do I do if I don't understand this? I'm like, I would ask them.
Yeah. Find out.
What that is. What about currently? I mean, how do you feel like that you're getting to fully explore your curiosity in your current work?
Yeah, I mean, my current work is built around a system that tries to almost not automate, but bring some rigor and structure to the exploration process. So when I work with clients, I'll start off by digging into their industry, and then we'll be digging into their audience, and then we'll come up with behavioral segmentations. And every step of the way is discovery interviews and research. And the fun part is sifting through all of these different sources of information, making connections, and also finding gaps. And so my background is largely as a CEO, where you need to make payroll and, you need to wear 50 different hats. And so probably for the first time in my career, I'm actually able to just be curious on a regular basis and try to get to value the questions rather than the answers as being the most important part of what gets done, at least for my side of things, which is usually taking an organization or a fledgling solution and figuring out how to get it to scale and make lots of money and hopefully do good in the world at the same time.
That is interesting that maybe wearing all the other hats puts constraints on your ability to wear a particular hat quite as.
I mean, I think there are people that are probably more proficient in executive roles than I have been throughout my career, but oftentimes I mean, boundaries are very important, but when you're the CEO of an organization, sort of every part of the business, if it's not your responsibility, it's someone that reports to yours responsibility. And so oftentimes I've caught myself putting out fires versus asking the big questions when I've known that, in that role, your primary job is to ask the big questions. It's to know what you don't know. But sometimes you can really get lost in the day-to-day. And so for someone of slightly less capability like myself, it's fun to just have one lane to stay in, and it's that discovery and growth lane, and bring folks in and then tell the person that's in charge, okay, here's what we learned, here's what we don't know, here's the next test to run, if it works out, these 3 doors open. What do you think, boss? It's wonderful to be unburdened from the responsibility of needing to put out every fire.
I find and sounds like what you're describing, but I'm going to put it in different words. What we do know is very often that if we follow a series of steps or process that has worked for us in the past, that it will work for us again. We just don't know what it will tell us along the way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm generally a believer that when you take appropriate to the circumstance processes and talented people and have them put in good effort, over time, you're going to generate strong results. This goes back to earlier in our conversation when we're talking about luck and making your own luck. That's my best approach to making your own luck. And unfortunately, that's over time. In the short run, you may come up empty-handed. You might have asked the wrong question in the first place in spite of your best intentions and efforts. And then you've done a great job at doing the wrong thing. I've certainly been at the receiving and dealing end of that. And so it's no fun. So the hope is that over time, by embracing those best practices, you generate value.
It works more than it doesn't work. And you're probably not going to put yourself in a situation where it's game over, so long as you're got some discipline around doing the right sorts of things with the right sort of intention.
Yeah, and I think the same curiosity, when you're getting to know somebody and that you don't know about their family, or that you don't know about their past work history, and you dive into that because you want to show interest and because you're genuinely curious. I think interrogating processes, particularly those that we know work, just as important, where you can kind of go back and say, okay, this worked 5 years ago for these kinds of companies, but are we confident it's going to work here? And what could we test here to see how we turn it around? I think too often when we are exposed to a novel person or to a novel approach, we're very skeptical, or we're very curious, or we lean into interrogating it. It's our spouses, it's our core processes for our business that a lot of times we're so close to that we're lacking that curiosity. And really digging in, we'll oftentimes learn something we never knew before. And that's powerful, right? When you learn something you never knew about your spouse, or you find a capability within your team, your core team, your business partner, or a process that you've used for 50 different clients, and you find a new way to use it. At least for me, that's
amazing.
It just sort of feels like you're really alive when you find those glimmers, because you weren't expecting it, right? And that's a huge part of delight is when something exceeds our expectations.
It feels like it's just unleashing something out of people.
Well, when the familiar feels new, and again, going back to so many of us having been locked in our homes for over a year and everything, finding the new and the familiar is almost a survival tactic, or it was for 2020, right?
Yeah. Well, I know we're running up on sort of the end of our 30 minutes, and I want to respect your time. I feel like there's a lot that we could continue to talk about, but is there anything, I don't know, like something that I haven't asked about that I should have asked about as it relates to this heuristic, or something else?
Oh my goodness. Well, I think the most important thing for a heuristic like this is thinking about how you apply it in real life. It's all well and good to talk about stories and theory. And at least for me, on digging into knowing what I don't know, is as simple as it sounds. This whiteboard is my best friend. Anytime I tackle a project, I like to try to outline the questions we need to be asking, the best people to ask, the best resources to dig into. And knowing and not knowing is this very black and white continuum. I love doing confidence exercises. I love checking in with people's confidence, when we do discovery with them. And I like to do it with the team as well. So, okay, we know this, or the client knows this. At what level of confidence? And then what's great is that's just sort of a good little thumbtack of, okay, we're at a 7 out of 10, an 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10. Then when we sit down with the client who said, okay, we're a 10 out of 10 on this, well, great, what's the evidence? And that gets really interesting. You know what I mean? So I think there are a couple different levels of interrogating what we know versus what we don't know. And we tend to find that actually it's various shades of gray that we can sort of mark down. And then when we look at these areas of low confidence, well, then particularly if they're vital to the project, that's where our risk is. And thus that's where our experimentation should begin, or that's where our discovery should begin. And so I think when you start to make this black and white, it becomes gray. And in that grayness, it can become actionable in how we make decisions. And in that, I think it's more powerful than the truism, right? Oh, what we know what we know, or we don't know what we don't know. And it's, okay, cool.
That's
But
nice.
let's operationalize this. So that's how I do it. Again, I'm sure there's probably a lot better ways to, but just doing that for half an hour before undertaking any project can really unlock different paths, different approaches, different vectors. It can move you and your co-parties to agreeing on what you don't know, which is very powerful than maybe me assuming that you don't know it and you thinking that you do. Sometimes it can lead to uncomfortable conversations, right? But relationships are so much more powerful when they're based on agreement versus sort of unspoken expectation. And by taking knowns and unknowns and making them concrete, we can move towards that. So yeah, that's just sort of parting thought if the theory babble that I put out wasn't too useful. Putting stuff up on a whiteboard, labeling it with confidence intervals, and then interrogating those with all the involved stakeholders to figure out what you really do know and don't know. That process can open up new paths.
Like how do we know?
Yeah.
If we do know, how do we know? Mm-hmm.
And then if we don't know, how will we know? That could be a whole other half hour, but probably
at least.
Sleep, yeah.
Danvers, thank you so very much. It's everything I expected, and I hope we get a chance to talk again soon.
Yeah, this is super fun, Alicia. Thanks so much for having me on.